He thought someone had broken into the mansion that night, but the truth waiting behind that locked door would stay with him for the rest of his life. Adrian Moretti rarely returned home before midnight. Most evenings ended with meetings, phone calls, and responsibilities that seemed to multiply every year. By the time his black sedan rolled through the iron gates of the estate, the world was usually asleep. That night was no different. A cold autumn wind swept across the grounds as he stepped from the car and adjusted the collar of his charcoal overcoat. The mansion stood silent against the dark sky, its towering windows glowing softly with warm light. Everything appeared normal, predictable, controlled, exactly the way Adrian preferred it. For nearly a decade, he had built his life around order. Order protected people. Order prevented mistakes. Order kept painful memories buried where they belonged. He nodded to the night security guard and entered through the main doors. The marble foyer was empty except for the distant ticking of an antique clock. Most of the staff had gone home hours earlier. The remaining employees would already be asleep in the staff wing. Adrian loosened his tie as he crossed the hall toward the grand staircase. Then he stopped. A sound drifted through the silence. Faint, almost impossible to hear. He turned his head. There it was again. A voice. Someone was speaking. Adrian frowned. The voice was coming from the east wing, an older section of the mansion that was rarely used anymore. He stood motionless for several seconds, listening. The sound continued. Quiet. Steady. Unmistakable. Nobody should have been there. The east wing contained little more than unused rooms and storage areas. Most nights it sat completely empty. Adrian immediately assumed the simplest explanation. Someone had entered the property without permission. The estate was secure, but security systems were not perfect. He changed direction and began walking toward the sound. His footsteps echoed softly across polished floors. The deeper he moved into the east wing, the quieter the mansion seemed to become. Portraits of long-forgotten relatives watched from shadowed walls. Moonlight spilled through narrow windows and stretched across the carpet. The voice grew clearer. It was a woman's voice. Calm, gentle, reading something aloud. Adrian slowed. The voice seemed completely unconcerned. Not nervous, not hurried. Whoever it belonged to sounded comfortable, as though they had done this many times before. The hallway ended at a small door near the back corner of the wing. Adrian knew the room. Years ago it had been used as a private study. Now it remained locked and largely forgotten. Yet a faint strip of warm light glowed beneath the door. He stared at it. The voice continued from inside. Reading. Telling a story. Adrian felt genuine confusion for the first time that evening. Why would anyone be inside that room at this hour? He stepped closer. The old wooden floor creaked beneath his shoes. The voice paused briefly and then resumed. He could not make out every word, but the tone carried something unusual. Kindness. Patience. Warmth. Qualities Adrian rarely encountered anymore. His hand moved toward the doorknob. For a moment he hesitated. Something about the scene felt strangely intimate, as though he were standing on the edge of a secret not meant for him. Yet curiosity pushed him forward. Slowly he turned the handle. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. The voice continued from the other side. Adrian pushed the door open a few inches. Warm light spilled into the dark hallway. His eyes adjusted, and the moment he saw who was inside, every assumption he had made disappeared. Adrian expected to find an intruder. He expected to find carelessness, curiosity, or some simple explanation that would allow him to close the door and forget the entire incident. Instead, he found Grace Walker sitting alone in the center of the room. The old study looked nothing like he remembered. Shelves that had once held dusty records were now lined with children's books. Small lamps cast a warm golden glow across the walls. A worn rug covered the hardwood floor. Boxes filled with neatly organized notebooks sat beside a narrow desk. Grace did not notice him standing in the doorway. She was too focused on the microphone resting in front of her. In one hand, she held an open storybook. In the other was a pencil covered with handwritten notes. Her voice filled the room with gentle warmth as she continued reading. The little rabbit looked up at the stars and realized that even the darkest night could not hide every light. Adrian remained completely still. He had never heard Grace speak like this. During the day, she was polite and quiet, efficient, almost invisible. Yet here her voice carried life, emotion, and kindness. She turned a page and continued reading. Occasionally, she stopped to repeat a sentence with a slightly different tone. Sometimes she smiled at a funny moment in the story, even though nobody appeared to be listening. Adrian slowly looked around the room. More details emerged. Stacks of audio recordings sat carefully labeled on nearby shelves. Envelopes were pinned to a bulletin board. Colorful drawings decorated one corner of the room. None of it made sense. Grace finished the chapter and pressed a button on the recording device. A small red light disappeared. She exhaled softly and reached for a notebook. Story number 214, she whispered to herself while writing something down. Adrian felt genuine confusion. 214. This was not a hobby she had started recently. This was something she had been building for a very long time. Grace selected another book from a nearby stack and opened it carefully. Before beginning, she paused and looked toward a collection of letters resting on the desk. Her expression softened. She picked up one envelope and unfolded the paper inside. Even from the doorway, Adrian could see bright crayon drawings covering the page. Grace smiled. "I am glad you liked the pirate story, Emma," she said quietly. "I promise another one is coming soon." Adrian stared at her. She was speaking to the letter as though speaking directly to the child who had written it. There was no audience, no recognition, no reward, only sincerity. Grace returned the letter to its place and adjusted the microphone. Then she began reading again. The room seemed warmer with every word. For reasons he could not explain, Adrian found himself unable to leave. The mansion outside remained silent. The clock somewhere down the hall continued ticking. Yet inside this forgotten room, hidden away from everyone else, Grace had created an entirely different world. And standing unnoticed in the doorway, Adrian realized he was witnessing a side of her that nobody had ever shown him before. Adrian did not sleep that night. Long after Grace finished recording and quietly left the old study, he remained standing alone inside the room. The silence felt different now, almost sacred. He slowly walked between the shelves, studying everything she had built without anyone noticing. There were hundreds of recordings. Some were organized by age, others by genre. Adventure stories, fairy tales, historical stories, bedtime stories. Every box contained dozens of carefully labeled files. On one shelf sat a collection of handmade cards. Adrian picked one up. The front displayed a drawing of a rainbow and a smiling sun. Inside, written in uneven handwriting, were simple words. "Thank you for reading to us when we cannot sleep." Adrian stared at the card longer than he expected. He placed it back exactly where he found it and picked up another. Then another. Each carried a similar message. Gratitude, hope, comfort. The next morning, Adrian arrived at breakfast earlier than usual. Through the dining room windows, he watched employees move across the estate grounds as the sun climbed above the horizon. Among them was Grace. She carried a basket of fresh linens toward the main house, moving with the same quiet efficiency she displayed every day. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had spent hours the previous night creating recordings for strangers. She looked exactly the same. That was what unsettled him most. People usually wanted recognition for good deeds. They wanted praise, appreciation, attention. Grace appeared to want none of those things. Later that afternoon, Adrian found himself thinking about the room again. Finally, curiosity overcame restraint. He called the estate manager into his office. "How long has Grace worked here?" The manager glanced at a tablet. "Almost 1 year, sir." "Any problems?" "None." The answer came immediately. "She is one of our most dependable employees." Adrian nodded. "Does anyone know what she does after work?" The manager looked confused. "After work? Never mind." Adrian dismissed him a moment later. Yet the question remained. By evening, he returned to the old study. This time the room was empty. Sunlight filtered through the windows and illuminated details he had missed during the night. There were photographs pinned beside the letters. Children smiling in hospital rooms. Nurses standing beside small bookshelves. Families holding portable audio players. At the center hung a handwritten note. Curiosity pulled him closer. The note read, "Every child deserves a story, especially on the days when life feels frightening." Adrian read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Something about those words lingered inside him. For years he had measured success through numbers, influence, and accomplishments. Yet standing in that small forgotten room, surrounded by evidence of quiet kindness, he found himself questioning whether he had overlooked something far more important. As he turned to leave, His eyes landed on a notebook resting near the microphone. It lay partially open. He hesitated before reading a single line written across the page. "Someday I hope these stories help someone feel less alone." Adrian froze. The handwriting belonged to Grace. And for the first time in many years, he realized he wanted to know the story of the person who had written those words. Over the next several days, the old study became impossible for Adrian to ignore. He never mentioned it to Grace. He never asked questions. Yet every evening his thoughts drifted back to the forgotten room hidden in the East Wing. On Thursday afternoon, after a long meeting downtown, he found himself walking there again. Sunlight poured through the narrow windows, illuminating floating dust particles and rows of carefully organized shelves. The room felt alive in a way the rest of the mansion did not. Adrian moved slowly between the books, examining details he had overlooked before. A collection of stuffed animals sat neatly arranged in one corner. Handwritten bookmarks rested inside dozens of storybooks. Colorful drawings covered an entire wall. None of it belonged in a mansion built around wealth and prestige. Yet somehow it felt more meaningful than any expensive artwork hanging elsewhere in the estate. His attention settled on a wooden box placed beneath the bulletin board. Curious, he opened it. Inside were hundreds of letters. Some were folded carefully. Others were decorated with stickers, crayons, and glitter. Adrian selected one at random. The handwriting was shaky and uneven. "Dear Miss Grace, thank you for reading the astronaut story. I listened to it 3 times before my surgery. It made me feel brave." Adrian stared at the page. Slowly, he picked up another letter. Then another. "Thank you for helping me sleep. Thank you for making the hospital less lonely. Thank you for helping me stop being scared." The messages continued for pages. Child after child. Family after family. Gratitude filled every line. Adrian lowered himself into a chair beside the desk. For nearly half an hour he read in silence. Some letters came from nurses, others from parents. Many included photographs. Children smiling beside portable audio players. Young patients holding books. Families gathered around hospital beds listening to stories together. The impact was impossible to ignore. Grace had never spoken about any of this. Not once. Later that evening, Adrian happened to pass through the kitchen as several employees prepared for the next day. Grace stood at a counter organizing supplies. She laughed softly at something another employee said before returning to her work. Watching her from across the room, Adrian felt strangely unsettled. There was no sign of the secret world she had built. No indication that she spent countless hours recording stories for strangers she would never meet. She simply carried on with her responsibilities as though none of it mattered. As though kindness was as ordinary as breathing. That night Adrian returned to the study one final time before bed. On the desk rested a small stack of unopened envelopes that had arrived earlier that week. One had already been partially opened. He glanced down and noticed a photograph tucked inside. A young girl sat in a hospital room holding headphones and smiling broadly. On the back someone had written a simple message. "She asked for your stories every night. Thank you for giving her something to look forward to." Adrian remained motionless. The mansion around him felt very quiet. And for the first time in many years, he began wondering whether the most important work in the world was often done by people nobody bothered to notice. The question followed Adrian everywhere. Why would someone devote so much time, energy, and care to people she had never met? The answer seemed simple at first. Grace was kind. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt there had to be something deeper beneath the surface. One rainy afternoon, he finally decided to learn more. Not through investigators or reports. Through ordinary conversations. He began paying attention. Over the following week, he noticed small things. Grace always arrived early. She often stayed late. If a coworker seemed tired, she quietly offered help without being asked. If someone forgot lunch, she somehow found a way to share her own. None of these actions were dramatic. Most people barely noticed them. Yet once Adrian started looking, he saw them everywhere. One evening, he entered the kitchen and found Grace sitting alone at a small table during her break. A notebook rested beside her coffee. She was writing something with complete concentration. Adrian almost turned around and left. Then curiosity kept him there. "Working even during your break?" he asked. Grace looked up, surprised but polite. "Just organizing story ideas." Adrian nodded toward the notebook. "For the recordings?" "Yes." A faint smile appeared on her face. Children are very honest critics. Adrian found himself smiling back. I imagine they are. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh bread and coffee. Finally, Adrian asked the question that had been growing inside him for days. How did all of this start? Grace looked down at her notebook. The smile faded slightly. Not from sadness, more from memory. A long time ago, she said quietly, I spent several years moving between foster homes. Adrian remained silent. Grace rarely talked about herself. Some places were good, she continued. Some were not. But there was one volunteer who visited every week. Her eyes softened. She brought books. Adrian listened carefully. She would sit with us and read stories. Sometimes it was the best part of the entire week. The room grew still. Grace looked toward the rain-covered window. When you are a child, stories can become safe places. Adrian felt something tighten in his chest. And you never forgot her. Grace shook her head. No, I never did. For several seconds, neither moved. Then she laughed softly. The funny thing is, I do not even remember her last name. Adrian looked at the notebook resting on the table. Hundreds of recordings. Hundreds of letters. Countless hours. All because one person had once chosen to be kind. So that is why you do it, he said. Grace nodded. Someone gave me comfort when they did not have to. She closed the notebook gently. I just wanted to pass it along. Adrian stared at her. The answer was simple. Honest. Completely free of self-importance. And as he watched Grace return to organizing her notes, he realized something remarkable. The forgotten volunteer had changed one child's life years ago, and without ever knowing it, that kindness was still spreading through the world. After that conversation, something shifted inside Adrian. He could not remember the last time a simple story had affected him so deeply. For years his world had been measured by transactions, negotiations, schedules, and responsibilities. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a result. Yet Grace seemed to live by a completely different set of rules. She gave her time without expecting anything in return. She invested effort into people she would probably never meet. Most surprising of all, she never spoke about it unless someone asked. Over the following weeks, Adrian found himself noticing things he had overlooked before. One afternoon, he watched from a second-floor balcony as Grace helped a new employee learn her duties. She never rushed her, never acted impatient. Later that same day, he saw her leave a handwritten note beside a co-worker's lunch after learning the woman's mother was recovering from surgery. The note was simple. Thinking of you today. That was all. Yet the employee carried it around for the rest of the afternoon. The pattern repeated everywhere. Small acts. Quiet kindness. No audience. No recognition. One evening, Adrian arrived at the old study earlier than usual. The room was empty except for a stack of newly delivered letters waiting on the desk. Sunlight from the setting sun filled the room with a warm amber glow. Curious, he sorted through the envelopes. Most came from hospitals across the country. One envelope contained a photograph of a young boy sitting in bed, holding a stuffed dinosaur. Attached was a short message from his father. He listens to your recordings every night. For the first time in months, he looks forward to bedtime. Thank you. Adrian lowered the letter slowly. Something about those words stayed with him. He imagined the child, the father, the long nights neither of them had chosen. Then he looked around the room again. The books, the recordings, the letters. Grace had built all of this quietly while the rest of the world remained unaware. A short time later, he heard footsteps approaching the doorway. Grace entered carrying another box of books. She looked surprised to find him there. I hope I am not interrupting anything, Adrian said. Not at all. She set the box down beside the shelves. Adrian glanced toward the letters. More arrived today. Grace smiled. That usually means the recordings are helping someone. There was no pride in her voice. No attempt to impress him. Only gratitude. Adrian shook his head softly. You always say it like that. Grace looked puzzled. Like what? As though helping one person is enough. Grace thought about the question. Then she smiled. Sometimes one person is everything to somebody. The answer settled over the room like a quiet truth. Adrian looked out the window as evening shadows stretched across the estate grounds. For the first time in many years, he found himself questioning whether success had anything to do with influence at all. Because standing inside that small forgotten room, he was beginning to understand that the people who change lives rarely make headlines. Sometimes they simply read stories into a microphone and never asked for credit. 1 week later, a letter arrived that changed everything. It appeared no different from the hundreds of others stacked inside the old study. A simple white envelope. A handwritten address. Nothing unusual. Grace placed it beside the microphone and continued organizing books before beginning that evening's recording session. Adrian happened to be in the room when she picked it up. He had become a familiar presence there, though neither of them ever acknowledged how unusual that would have seemed a month earlier. Grace opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. As she read the first few lines, her expression changed. The smile faded. Her eyes softened. For several seconds, she simply stood there in silence. Adrian immediately noticed. "Everything all right?" he asked. Grace nodded once before handing him the page. "You should read this." Adrian accepted the letter and looked down. The handwriting belonged to a young girl named Lily. She explained that she had spent many months receiving treatment far from home. The hospital had often felt lonely and frightening, especially at night. Then a nurse introduced her to Grace's recordings. The stories became part of her daily routine. She listened before every procedure, before every difficult day, before every attempt to fall asleep. Near the bottom of the page, one sentence stood out. "Your stories reminded me that there were still good people in the world, even when I felt afraid." Adrian stopped reading. Something tightened in his chest. He looked up at Grace, who had already turned away, pretending to organize papers on the desk. Yet he could see the emotion she was trying to hide. "There is more," she said quietly. Adrian continued reading. Attached to the letter was a photograph. Lily stood outside the hospital smiling beneath bright summer sunlight. One arm held a stack of books. The other raised a thumbs up toward the camera. On the back, she had written a message. "Thank you for staying with me when nobody else could." The room fell silent. Adrian stared at the photograph longer than he intended. He thought about all the recordings, all the late nights, all the hours Grace spent speaking into a microphone after finishing long workdays. Until now, he had admired what she was doing. In that moment, he finally understood its impact. These were not simply stories. They were companionship, comfort, hope. Grace carefully returned the photograph to the envelope. "I keep every letter," she said softly. "Some days they remind me why I started." Adrian looked around the room. The shelves seemed different now. Every recording represented a child. Every letter represented a family. Every book represented time that Grace could have spent on herself, but chose to give away instead. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windows. The sound filled the silence between them. Adrian found himself thinking about his own life. About years spent chasing goals that always seemed to move farther away. About achievements that impressed people but rarely touched them. Then he looked at Grace. She had changed lives using little more than patience, kindness, and her voice. And for the first time in many years, Adrian felt something he had almost forgotten. Not admiration, not gratitude, something deeper. The quiet realization that one person could make the world brighter without ever standing in a spotlight. The conversation stayed with Adrian long after he left the study that evening. For days, he found himself thinking about Lily's letter, about the hundreds of children whose lives had been touched by a woman who never expected anything in return. The realization changed the way he looked at the estate and even the city beyond its gates. Everywhere he went, he began noticing people he had previously overlooked. The security guard standing outside in cold weather. The janitor quietly working after everyone else had gone home. The nurse he passed in the hospital while visiting a business associate. For years, Adrian had respected achievement. Now he was beginning to understand the value of compassion. One Saturday afternoon, he entered the study and found Grace sorting a new shipment of books that had arrived from a donation drive. Cardboard boxes filled the room. Children's novels, picture books, and collections of short stories covered nearly every available surface. Grace was kneeling beside a shelf, carefully organizing them by reading level. "You received all of these?" Adrian asked. Grace looked up and smiled. A community center heard about the recordings. She gently placed another book on the shelf. "They wanted to help." Adrian glanced around the room. "You never asked them?" "No, then why would they send so much?" Grace considered the question. "Because kindness tends to travel farther than people expect." Adrian laughed softly. "You always have an answer." "Not always." She stood and brushed dust from her hands. "Just sometimes." For a moment, they worked together in comfortable silence. Adrian carried books from one box while Grace organized them. It was a simple task, yet strangely satisfying. No meetings. No negotiations. No pressure. Just two people arranging stories that would eventually reach children across the country. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, Adrian noticed a framed photograph sitting on the desk. It showed a much younger Grace standing beside an elderly woman outside a small library. "Is that the volunteer?" he asked. Grace followed his gaze. Her expression immediately softened. "Yes." Adrian picked up the frame carefully. "You found her?" Grace nodded. "A few years ago. Did you tell her what happened?" A smile spread across Grace's face. "I did." Adrian waited. "And?" Grace looked down for a moment before answering. She cried. The simplicity of the response somehow carried more weight than a long explanation ever could. Adrian returned the photograph to its place. Then he asked a question he had been carrying for weeks. "Do you ever think about stopping?" Grace seemed genuinely surprised. "Stopping?" "The recordings. The letters. All of it." She looked around the room filled with books, drawings, and messages from children. Then she shook her head. "Every time I think about how much work it is, another letter arrives." Her eyes drifted toward the stack on the desk. "And then I remember that somewhere there is a child, waiting for the next story." Silence settled gently between them. Adrian looked around the room one more time. Months earlier, he had walked through the wrong door by accident. Now he understood that it had been the most important mistake he had made in years. Because in discovering Grace's secret world, he had slowly rediscovered a part of himself he thought was gone forever. Winter arrived quietly that year. Snow settled across the estate grounds, covering the gardens and walkways in white. Inside the mansion, life continued as it always had, yet Adrian knew something fundamental had changed. The old study in the East Wing no longer felt forgotten. Shelves that once held only a few books now stretched wall to wall with stories, letters, recordings, and donations sent from people across the country. What had begun as one woman's private act of kindness had become something much larger. One evening, shortly before Christmas, Adrian asked Grace to meet him in the study after dinner. She arrived carrying a stack of newly cataloged books and immediately noticed that something was different. The room had been transformed. New shelves lined the walls. Comfortable reading chairs filled the corners. Fresh recording equipment sat beside the microphone. Hundreds of additional books had been carefully organized throughout the room. Grace stopped in the doorway and stared. "What happened?" she asked softly. Adrian smiled. "People wanted to help." Grace slowly walked through the room, running her fingers along the shelves. Her eyes widened as she took in the changes. "This is incredible." Adrian watched her for a moment before handing her a small folder. Inside were plans for a new nonprofit program that would distribute recordings, books, and educational materials to children's hospitals throughout the country. Grace looked up at him, speechless. "You did this?" Adrian shook his head. No, his voice was calm. "You did." Silence filled the room. Outside, snow drifted past the windows beneath the glow of estate lights. Grace looked down at the plans again. "I never wanted recognition." "I know." Adrian nodded. "That is exactly why you deserve it." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Grace noticed a plaque mounted discreetly near the entrance. It did not carry Adrian's name. It carried a simple title: The Grace Walker Story Library. Her eyes immediately filled with emotion. "Adrian," he gently interrupted her. "Months ago I walked through the wrong door." He glanced around the room. "At least I thought it was the wrong door." Grace smiled through tears. Adrian looked toward the shelves, the letters, and the stories that had reached children he would never meet. For years he had believed influence came from authority. Now he understood that the greatest impact often came from compassion. The room remained quiet. Warm light reflected from the windows. Snow continued falling beyond the glass. And as Adrian stood beside the woman whose kindness had changed countless lives, he realized she had changed his as well. Not through power, not through persuasion, simply by showing him what goodness looked like when nobody was watching. The room went silent. In that winter, Adrian Moretti learned that kindness can reach places power never could, and the world remembered what dignity looks like.